Welcome to week 13 of my Unhitched webinar short series. These are a series of short, easily digestible webinars that cover some of the most common questions that I get in my practice and issues that I see come up for my clients. We are now going into week 13. Let's see. Okay, let's start that. Let me start again here. Welcome to week 13 of my Unhitched webinar short series. These are a series of short, easily digestible webinars designed to answer the questions that I hear most commonly in my practice and share some of the issues that I see the most frequently. This week, we are going to be covering part 2 of getting divorced gracefully. Last week, I realized I had more material that I could cover in 20 or 30 minutes, so I broke it into 2 parts. So today we will continue on. So you are in the right place if you are considering divorce, if you are moving in that direction already, or even if you are in the throes of it or post-divorce. A lot of what I'll be sharing here are tools and suggestions that can be applied at any point in that process. I have shared several times before in these webinars that one of the reasons this is really important to me to share this information is because I had a pretty high conflict marriage to a fellow attorney, but we ended up having a really surprisingly graceful divorce, and our post-divorce friendship was completely unexpected and such a blessing before my ex-husband passed in 2018, a little over a year ago. And so I want to share these suggestions with you in hopes that you might have a similar experience should you end up going down that path. So in terms of my other credentials, of course, my name is Sunny Joy McMillan. I'm a recovering attorney and a practicing coach. I am the author of the book Unhitched, Unlock Your Courage and Clarity to Unstick Your Bad Marriage. I'm the host of the radio show Sunny in Seattle. And my work has been featured in O Magazine, in the Collaborative Professionals of Washington, and some other legal groups, as well as Best Self Magazine and Hay House Radio, among other places. But as I mentioned a few moments ago, I think my most important credential here is my experience of having gone through this process myself and having been in many ways where you may be now. What we're going to do today is I'll spend about 20 minutes going through and sharing more tips and suggestions around how to get divorced gracefully. I won't be taking any questions today. We'll keep it nice and short, but if you do have questions or you want to take this further, I will share how to do so at the end here today. So just as a quick recap, last week there were a couple things I just wanted to mention, and of course you can, if you receive the recording, you can access this, but that just keeping in mind that divorce is not a failure, and if you feel like it is, my suggestion would be, or my invitation would be, to look at that as perhaps a limiting belief that is not necessarily true. And so in past webinars, we've talked about mind management, and there are some things that you can do to really reframe that. And in some cases that I have seen with my clients, divorce is a success for everyone involved, and it was in the highest and best interest. And in that way, it is not a failure. So reframing that can help give a lot of freedom when going through this process. Also, a couple other things to mention as a recap. Not to push through the divorce process so quickly in an attempt to avoid pain. I see a lot of people who just want to get it behind them because they think, oh, then the pain won't be there anymore and I'll just start my new chapter. And what I will suggest is that the pain will follow you. So it can be actually really beneficial to do your work as you're going through the process, so that when you do start the new chapter, you aren't carrying a lot of baggage with you. And that may mean putting the brakes on things going at warp speed to get just the divorce decree signed, and actually being really conscious and present as you go through the process. And then finally, remembering that, yes, there are laws in your state and there are regulations that you will need to follow around how to get divorced in the eyes of the state and the eyes of the law. But aside from that, you can write your own rules. And just because something has been done a certain way for eons, or it's how your friend's divorce went or your parents' divorce went, went doesn't mean it's how it has to go for you. There are various strategies during divorce, and if one that your attorney is proposing to you is morally repugnant, talk to them about that. If you need more time on something, ask for more time. So this really is up to you, as long as you stay within the bounds of the law, to get creative about how you need this to look for you and your soon-to-be ex-spouse, so that it is the most the healing, the way that the process can be, and it doesn't leave gaping wounds. As I mentioned in my past webinar last week, my ex and I did our property settlement early on, and then we sat on the decree for several years to help us really feel like we were in a healed place by the time we put our signatures on it. Our attorneys didn't like it, but it worked out, I think, the best for us in the end. So that's a recap of where we've been. So now on to this week. And before we dive in, I always like to do a little preface. This week, I'm going to share with you a quote, actually, that I wrote in my book. And let me just share my screen with you here. Divorce is not for the faint of heart, but it is for the strong of spirit. And it takes a strong spirit to actually start the wheels going down the road of divorce. I think for a lot of people, I see a lot of people who just stay in stagnation, stay in fear, stay in stuckness, and they are not happy in the marriage, but they're not doing anything to change or to fix it. And if a marriage can't be healed, I think miracles are possible in just about almost any situation. I mean, with the exclusion of if you're married to a narcissist, a sociopath, a psychopath, there's not a lot of evidence that those folks change. Or if you are married to an addict or an abuser, some of those situations, if the other party is not willing to change, really there is not as much room, I think, for healing of both parties together within the marriage, definitely separately. But when you aren't making the choice to heal the marriage, and it is beyond repair, sometimes people stay just out of fear. Fear of the unknown, because the unknown seems scarier than the tolerable situation they're in. And what I will suggest is that divorce can sometimes be the bravest, best choice for everybody involved. And only you really know that, getting in touch with your own intuition and inner wisdom and connection with, your integrity, the bedrock of your integrity and your truth. But I wanted to just share two things. Number one is a story from my book that I open with, and it's from a palliative care worker. So she's worked at the bedside of thousands upon thousands of people who are dying. And one of the primary regrets that she heard was that they have not lived a life that was true to themselves, that they did the shoulds, that they should have done this path, they should have stayed here, they shouldn't have gone there, all the things. And I will just suggest that think about that situation when you were on your deathbed. Was there a choice, a braver choice that you would have wanted to make? Is there a choice that would have been more true to yourself in making this decision? And only you know what is true to yourself. But in making this decision, be true to yourself. And getting divorced can be a brave decision, but it may be the one that is the most true for you. And then the second story I'll share is a little bit more lighthearted, and it's from, I don't know if you like Julia Louis-Dreyfus, the actress, as much as I do, that she had a short-lived comedy series called The New Adventures of Old Christine, and I love it. I own the box set, even though it was only several seasons long. But in this series, she is divorced, but she has a very close relationship with her ex-husband. They share custody of their little boy. And they were at one of his swim lessons, co-parenting together there, even though they were divorced. And he looked at her and he said, "I just want to thank you. I would never have had the courage to ask for the divorce. I would never have had the courage to call it. You made the brave decision, and thank you for making the brave decision that I was not able to make." And that may not be something that you hear from your spouse ever, or for a long time after the divorce. But to me, it's an example of being the brave of spirit, the courageous of spirit, strong of spirit, to make the highest and best decision, even if it's not an easy one, even if your spouse is not a huge fan of it. It may be, looking back on it several years down the road, the best thing that you could have done. And in that case, you can be thanked for allowing each party to go free into the next chapter of their life and doing the most gracious thing you can do, freeing both of you to be the best that you can be that maybe wasn't possible when you were together. So that's my preface. So now let's get into the tips, tangible tips. So how to avoid nuclear warfare in your divorce. So one of the best things just at the outset is when you know you're going down that road, a lot of people, the inclination, and you may have friends in your ear, you may have family members that have done it this way, you know, lawyer up, start getting those interests protected. You don't want them taking your stuff and getting custody of your kids and all of the things. And a line can get drawn in the sand and things can get contentious, and it really sets you up in a position of mine, 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 and I'm fighting for what's mine, and it is not a very problem-solving environment. It is a winner-take-all attitude, and that doesn't leave a lot of room for grace, peace, and compromise. So there are other models out there available, and it's surprising to me still to this day how few people have heard about this, but there is something called the collaborative law model. And all states will have some version of this. It was developed, I believe it was originated in Minnesota, and it applies, I think it's most frequently applied in family law, but it's also, I think, been applied in employment law and some other places as well, but you probably will hear about it most frequently in family law, which is awesome. That's what we're talking about here today. But basically it means that all the parties in the legal action agree not to go to court. So basically you will have an attorney, your spouse will have an attorney, and instead of each being on your respective sides in your respective spaces, coming up with a strategy and trying to get your way, you will all sit in a room together and problem solve. They will bring in at the outset the professionals that are necessary, perhaps a parenting coach or therapist, perhaps a financial professional if there are a lot of assets to be figured out. And while it can be a little more heavy in upfront costs, in the long run, it usually ends up being about the same because you may end up piecemealing it if you do the traditional model. You may later have to bring in an expert financial witness. You may later have to bring in the parenting expert to help figure out the custody arrangement. And to me, if everybody sits around a table at the outset and agrees to problem solve, it takes the threat of the courtroom off the table. It can't be used as a weapon. And it doesn't mean you can't get out of the agreement if you need to go to court later, but I think the instances of that happening are pretty few and far between. In fact, I don't know of any in my own personal realm of experience, and I work pretty closely with the collaborative law community in Seattle and King County. So I will just say that that model is out there. There are other variations. Getting together with your spouse, if there aren't a lot of complicated assets to figure out, you guys are amicable, figuring it out between the two of you, and then having an attorney rubber stamp it. I don't recommend that because there are some complicated things that need to be, that an attorney's advice can at least be very helpful on, but it's not necessary. I've had clients who are, they're pretty young, they don't have kids, they don't have any assets, they don't have any debt, they just kind of go their separate ways, and that's awesome. There's no need to make it more complicated than it needs to be. And there are mediators that you can get together and in front of, and the mediator can tell you how how the court will split the baby, so to speak, if you were to take it that way. So there's so many options. So I'm just saying, avoid nuclear warfare. You don't have to lawyer up and make it a big to-do. The second thing that I will say, and I alluded to this a second ago, if you do decide to engage attorneys and you're not using the collaborative law model, or even if you are, quite frankly, your attorney is not a weapon. And what I mean by that is, and I'll use myself as an example. In my own marriage, my ex-husband, or my husband at the time, was a very successful trial attorney, and his happy place was in the courtroom. He was a master in the courtroom. He was a master in a deposition and having someone on the witness stand. He functioned really well in high conflict situations. I did not. And while I consider myself now a very empowered person within the marriage, I felt very powerless. Like my voice was not heard. Like it didn't matter how loud I screamed. It was like I wasn't heard. I didn't feel like I had final say in things because he was much more, he brought into the marriage great wealth. I did not. And so I kind of felt like he held the purse strings, he held the power. So by the time we hit divorce, I had this river of resentments that had, was actually turning into a tidal wave. And I thought, I've never been heard in this marriage. By golly, I'm going to be heard in this divorce. And so one of the attorneys that I initially met with to see about retaining is a very well-known attorney in Austin, a female attorney who, while I knew her personally, while I'd been on committees with her, I adored her as a person. When you hired her as an attorney in a family law matter, it sent a very clear message that things were going to go nuclear. You could expect certain things within the litigation. And when I told my then husband that I had met with her, he didn't say a lot. He was like, okay, duly noted. We are lawyering up. Get ready for World War III. Because I wanted this woman to do in the proceedings what I had not felt capable of doing in the marriage. I wanted to send a message that would finally be heard. And if I couldn't have done it, then she would do it, and how we went down with the divorce. And that is not the best strategy. And in the end, ultimately, I hired this lovely older gentleman who'd been in the Texas bar for like 30 plus years, very well respected, very even keel, just a good, someone you wanted on the other side. I mean, the people who were opposing counsel liked working with him. And so ultimately, that's who I went with. And the proceedings went a very different way. And we ended up doing the collaborative law model, which, of course, the proceedings went in a very different way than they would have had the alternative, that first choice that I mentioned, come to fruition. But in your case, if there are things that you need to say, if there are things you haven't felt heard on, if you are angry as hell, if there are resentments you want resolved, hiring an attorney to be your front man is not the way to do it. Do your work, get brave, get a therapist, get together with the therapist jointly if you can't say the things to your spouse by yourselves. We did that in my own marriage. We had separate therapists, and then we would come together while we were going through the divorce and had a therapist that we would meet with. And that was the way that we communicated, because we always just seemed to be talking past one another. We weren't heard. I felt sometimes like it wasn't even worth talking. So if you are in that situation, get the right professionals engaged and do your work. Don't expect your attorney to be your heavy. Okay, so even if you decide to avoid nuclear warfare and you want things to be peaceful, that doesn't mean that your spouse will be in the same place. So what do you do if your spouse brings out the nukes? And there are a couple of things that you can do. And the first thing that I will say, the first and foremost thing that I will say is manage your own energy. And what do I mean by that? I will share a little example from one of my mentors. So one of my mentors, while she has been doing all of her own personal growth work, one of the things she did along the way, because she felt pretty unsafe based on some trauma in her childhood, she studied martial arts. And one of the forms that she studied was Aikido. And if you're not familiar with it, it is a martial art form based more on inner power than physical brute strength. And one of the examples she used from her Aikido master that she learned from, he was a border patrol agent. And I know that's a very charged term right now. This is several years ago that she worked on this, and this was actually a very nice man. And his job was actually to go to make the arrests on people who were running drugs between countries, and also the coyotes who, and these are people, not the animal, who would bring over immigrants, take their money, and then leave them in an 18-wheeler in the middle of the desert to die. Like really awful, awful people. And so this Aikido master, what you would find when you practice this martial art form is that being in a master's presence, who is an Aikido master, the energy field or the power that they have around them can actually stop someone coming at them. It's as if the way it's described is that in this force of love that they exude, that people just fall, like they can't even breach it. And so this border patrol agent said that what he would do before he went into these situations, before you knock on or break down the hotel room door where these guys are sitting around with guns, usually using drugs, so they're kind of the most dangerous and unpredictable that you can imagine, he would envision that everyone in the room was already dead. Not that he wished them dead, but that in the sense that there was already peace in the situation, that he wouldn't be all amped up, that everything was already calm in the room. And he said when he went in that energy, that it was crazy how the guys don't even reach for their guns. They just kind of look at him as if he was invited to a summer picnic in their room. And so you can look up Aikido and examples of this and more research on it. But I share this because it's an example of how when you are grounded in your own beingness, in your own energy, in your own rooted in who you really are, and you're in a calm space where you're not in fight or flight, where you are exuding peace, you have the ability to entrain the people around you. And entrainment is just basically, humans, we have mirror neurons. So when people are with you, we are actually wired so that we will reflect what the other person is feeling and doing. So if you can, through your own work and grounding yourself in a solid foundation, come into these proceedings, come into the interaction with your soon-to-be ex-spouse, in this place of, just like the Aikido master, grounded in love, in peace, you can affect the things that are going on around you. And even if you can't bring them into your peace, you certainly aren't going to spin out into their chaos. So it's just like being the strong foundation in a tornado. Your spouse may be the tornado, but if you've got a solid concrete foundation that you are grounded in, you don't get picked up by the tornado. So work on managing your own energy and look up Aikido if you want some examples of this powerfully in action. The other thing that I would recommend is visualization. We all know now that top athletes, they talk about it all the time. This is not woo-woo. There are so many studies now. One of my favorites is a study done on people in a lab who just visualized doing like bicep curls versus another group that they sent to the gym to do the bicep curls. Now, the ones that went to the gym had a little bit increased growth, but the ones who sat in a lab and merely visualized doing bicep curls, just visualized it, didn't move their arm, ended up having increased muscle mass in the area that they visualized. Visualization works. We know it does now. And there are plenty of studies on that if you want to look that up as well. So if we know that it works, why not visualize how you want the proceedings to go? This is not a guarantee. That's how it's going to go down for a variety of reasons. But you have more power and it affects your being if you visualize what you want it to be like. So I would visualize going in and having a smiling interaction in this room where we'd have our negotiations. I would envision a hug with my spouse. I would envision leaving feeling peaceful and light, not angry and in fight or flight. And it really worked. It affected the proceedings. And the last thing that I will mention on this in terms of tips is take care of yourself, self-care, meaning it may feel like, you want to go and buffer. We've talked about buffering in past ones, meaning go have a bottle of wine after the proceedings, go do, take prescription meds to kind of mask what you're feeling. And I'm not saying every once in a while don't do these things. I'm just saying if your go-to thing is to drink a bottle of wine, which will then mess up your sleep, which will then make you feel crappy the next day, all of the things, like think about in terms of self-care. We're not talking like a bubble bath and a pedicure. Those things are nice. But I'm talking about feeding your body with good nutrition, getting proper rest, not buffering with things that will leave you with a bit of a hangover. And it could be, gambling, shopping, pornography, any of the things that we use as humans to not feel what we feel, to not have to deal with what we're going through. It could be binge watching Netflix or being on social media. If you're using it to buffer because there's usually an element of something that comes along on the back end that's pretty unpleasant. So just be aware. Take good care of yourself. This is the time not to fall into ways that are going to be distractions and numbing, but the time to show up for yourself and take care of yourself so that you can be the best version of yourself and be present as you're going through this. And the last, I will share a quick story with you. This is from an author that I like named Janet Connor. And she was going through a divorce that was actually like, she feared for her life. Her husband was threatening her life. She had a young child at the time. She was afraid for her life and her child's safety, and their police were involved. It was a very scary situation. So what she did, this is a form of self-care, which is why I bring it up, and what she did in the process, she would actually write her rage. So she would just write all of how angry she was and how fearful she was. And she would write and write and write and write until her hand was exhausted or the pen ran out or whatever. ultimately that writing became a book. And it became a writing workshop that she now teaches. And the book and the workshop, they're called Writing Down Your Soul. And so by her journaling and journaling and journaling, bringing it up and out of her body and onto the page so it wasn't just stewing inside of her. We've talked about what happens when we suppress emotions in past webinars. So she actually brought it all out. So she was a much cleaner version on the inside. And it ended up becoming her life's work in the end after the divorce. Okay, so now we are almost at, well, it is 10:26. Okay, so you know what? I'm going to call it, and we're going to do a part 3 on this. We'll just combine it next week with how to heal after your divorce, because I want to make these a little more manageable. So anyway, tune in for part 3. We're going to talk about a divorce ceremony. That may be something you're not familiar with, but I will tell you about mine. I will share with you maybe even a short video if there is time in the webinar of a really beautiful divorce ceremony. So show up next week and we will talk about combined graceful divorce and healing after divorce, because there's some neat things that you can do that I did with my ex, which is why we had the friendship we did. So pitfalls I see, really trying to rush through the process, and even if it's ugly, just trying to get through it, like letting things go nuclear just so you can get it behind you, even if you are not thinking about the scorched earth that you're going to leave in your wake. So slow things down, be conscious, don't go nuclear, and you will end up much more whole on the other side of it than if you do the opposite. And let's see, the other thing is not honoring the process. And we'll talk more about that next week, but you can actually use divorce to be a catalyst for other things and honor it for the healing that it can, prompt in you. So if you do have questions about your situation, you want to take the work further, then what I will suggest is I invite you to schedule a little consult with me. I'm going to drop my scheduling link in the chat box. If you want to just click on that link, it will take you to my schedule. You can do the complimentary consult there. If you are listening to this later and you can't see the link, I recommend that you download my book, Unhitched. The website to go to do that is unhitchedbook.com. That's unhitchedbook.com. And there you can download the ebook version of my book. You can also get my contact information if you want to reach out to me. So thank you for being here for week 13. We are going to wrap these up at the end of just a couple more weeks here. So just a few more to go. And you can join me next week as we will do part 3 of A Graceful Divorce and healing after divorce. So thank you for joining me. Take care. Bye.